Welcome to our listeners. I'm your host, Kyle Kirby. I am the pastor for preaching at Grace Fellowship Church in Albion, Illinois. I'm also the founder and director of the Christian Heritage Center. Today, on this interview time or this time that we have, we're going to consider the life, ministry, and legacy of the Reverend Robert Murray M'Cheyne. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Jordan Stone, pastor, professor, and an individual who's been impacted a great deal by the Reverend Robert Murray M'Cheyne, his writings, his life, and his ministry. If this is your first time joining us, the Christian Heritage Center is a ministry that seeks to honor, preserve, and learn from the heritage of godly figures in the past to better serve the church today. We want to bring the treasures of the past into modern day sight and encourage brothers and sisters in the church today to learn from these figures. To begin, I think it'd be appropriate to have Dr. Stone to briefly introduce yourself and your background and your ministry. Share as much or as little as you want, brother. But also, could you elaborate on how you were originally or first exposed and brought into contact with Robert Murray M'Cheyne? And thank you for being here, brother.
Well, Kyle, it's good to be with you today. I do appreciate your invitation and also the ongoing work of the Christian Heritage Center. I do hope that it proves to be a blessing to many people over the coming years as the Lord tarries, because learning from saints of old and growing in godliness through past examples of holiness, I think, is always a wonderful thing in the Christian life. I currently pastor Redeemer Presbyterian Church in McKinney, Texas. That's a congregation in the PCA. I've been there for about 8 years at this point. I've been in ministry for just over 2 decades in North Texas at a few different churches, kind of going from what tends to be an ordinary sweep of working first in a church setting as a youth pastor, and then now serving as a senior pastor, having in between been an associate pastor and church planter. I'm married to Emily. We have 6 kids, and they span the age from essentially 15 down to 7. I also serve as a professor of pastoral theology at the Dallas campus here in town of Reformed Theological Seminary. I've been doing that. I think this fall begins my 7th year
Praise God.
at RTS. And so that tends to mean I just teach all the classes on practical pastoral theology, from preaching to worship, leadership, discipleship, a few other electives like Puritan history, so on and so forth. And as much as I can, I do smuggle Robert Murray M'Cheyne and lessons from his kind of school into all those classes, because I do think that he represents a model of ministry that's not only engaging, exciting, and worth imitating, but I do think also it's a ministry that is possible to emulate in a variety of ways. So I was first introduced to M'Cheyne actually through reading Martin Lloyd-Jones' book, Preaching and Preachers, and there's a few key sections in that book where he talks about M'Cheyne's example of holiness, or even commends his Bible reading plan. And so the very short story to what has been kind of a long study of M'Cheyne is I took those mentions and said, well, why don't I just try next year this M'Cheyne Bible reading plan? And I did that and really enjoyed it. And not long into kind of seeing, I think, some of the inner logic that belonged to what he was doing in that Bible reading plan, I thought, well, maybe it's good because I'm enjoying it so much that I learn more about who M'Cheyne is. And that just began that kind of lifelong study. Picked up Andrew Bonar's work on Robert Murray M'Cheyne, sent me down some other secondary sources in the same. And so by the time it came to work on my PhD dissertation proposal, I knew that I wanted to do something on M'Cheyne. It took me not terribly long to refine that down to what my academic work became, but that's really how M'Cheyne kind of got under my skin. And frankly, I still find him almost a weekly encouragement, because it's rare that a week goes by where there's not some reason to talk about M'Cheyne or read something in M'Cheyne. And so he's a blessing in all kinds of ways.
So what did you do your PhD work on?
Yeah, so I originally set out to do something. I thought I was planning on doing something on McShane and his
Mm,
school of friends, and I actually still
mm,
think that is a book, Lord willing, if someone doesn't beat me to it, I want to write
mm,
down the road. But when it came to working on the dissertation, I thought that was going to be a little bit broader of a subject than I wanted to do, especially the amount
mm,
of archival research that was going to be necessary to really adequately get around all of the friends. And so what I ended up
mm,
doing is thinking, okay, as I read through the sources on McShane, even as we'll talk about, no doubt, today, he tends to be celebrated as not just a man who pursued holiness, but it's more how he pursued
mm,
holiness. You know, as we would speak about it oftentimes as his use of the means of grace. And the more that I read
mm,
his sermons, noticed in his letters how he was counseling people, even in his journals talking about that own inner life within his pursuit of holiness, I realized that I think that there was a Christological reality
mhm,
that had gone missing in terms of why McShane was so zealous in his pursuit of holiness and
mm,
exactly why he went about reading the Bible the way he did, praying the way he did, so on and so forth.
mm,
And so I tried to unfold, and I think it actually came together quite usefully, just how his pursuit of Christ through the means of grace was all rooted in a love for Christ. And so
mm,
basically, my dissertation argued the pursuit of holiness is nothing more than the overflow of a heart who has known the love of Christ and then poured out in love to
mm,
Christ. That's a very generic way of getting under some of the more academic work that belonged to how he saw Song of Songs being a
mm,
essentially the book on holiness in the
mm,
Bible. And there's some kind of influence, as I would argue, of just the romantic philosophy of the time and his affectionate nature that gives birth to very specific ways he thinks about
mm,
what it looks like to pursue Jesus through the means of grace.
mm. Well, thank you for your work and labors in that area. And I'm sure the Lord will give that wide ranging and broad use. And I'm sure that He has. As I've researched McShane, I keep coming into articles you've written. And so there's a lot out there.
Yeah, and oftentimes I just actually wrote another one. It's
Uh,
I've got to submit it next week for, another very kind of large online publishing ministry. And I feel like I've written that kind of same article on McShane's spiritual
mm,
habits for just about every big outlet out there. And
mm,
he continues to be engaging and exciting. And so how can I write the same thing, for the sixth time in a way that seems to be somewhat different is
yeah,
sometimes a challenge, but it's always a joy to be able to have that opportunity.
absolutely. So, how long have you been walking with McShane as a friend, uh, as a whole?
Yeah. By this point, it would be almost 18 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Good friend to have alongside of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. So, for our listeners who may not know or may not have heard of Robert Murray McShane, he lived from 1813 to 1843. He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister whose brief yet very impactful life has left a lasting legacy for Christianity today. He was born in Edinburgh. He excelled academically and he was licensed to preach in 1835. The following year, he became the pastor of St. Peter's Church in Dundee, Scotland. He's known for his deep, rich, warm piety, his fervent and earnest preaching, and an evangelistic heart. McShane sought to edify and strengthen his congregation through a Christ exalting, exactly as you've been saying, brother, as a Christ exalting emphasis on prayer and scripture. Christ was at the center of everything that McShane did. He participated in a mission of inquiry in 1839 seeking to research the potential for missionary outreach to the Jews. His sermons, letters, and devotional writings reveal a heart that is profoundly captured and devoted to the Lord Jesus Christ. He was, in a sense, as I read McShane, and I think this is one thing that I would want our viewers to think of, the beauty of Christ really enamored him and compelled him and drew him to Christ. He was stricken with typhus, I believe, He died at the age of 29, yet his heritage endures to the present day. He's had a great influence and great impact on many, many people. Dr. Stone, what when you think of McShane and his early life and who he is and who he became, could you share a little bit about his early life, his early days, his upbringing, and then how that all influenced and impacted who he became and his ministry and so forth?
Yeah, and just to set some of the dates, like as you said, Kyle, he died at the age of 29, actually
Mm,
just about 6 weeks or so before he would have turned 30. He was
mm,
born in May of 1813 and died in March of 1831.
mm,
So he was born into a family in Edinburgh, in Scotland. His dad was a lawyer, and very much, it seems like in the source material, a disciplined, driven father, where his mother, Lockhart, she had a noticeable warmth and tenderness. And Robert was the youngest of the children. And it's quite clear in all the memorials and biographies of McShane that when it came to his early life, he demonstrated noticeable aptitude in a variety of things. He excelled in
mm,
academics. He was quite athletic, as the kind of early 19th century world would understand gymnastics. He was actually quite good with
mm,
gymnastics and flipping over bars and kind of just athletically using his body in that way. He was always a very popular student. He seemed to have a personality even before he was converted that was very attractive. And that would be something that after his conversion and his future ministry remained a noticeable part of his gospel
mm,
life as a pastor. He just had a personality that won people over.
mm,
But the most significant event in his early life, and he uses almost those exact same words, was when he was 18 years old. His eldest brother, David, who was 8 to 9 years older, he
mm,
died suddenly of a serious fever.
mm,
And as Robert even kind of speaks in his journals and even subsequent letters, and sometimes even pastoral counseling about his relationship with his brother, he talks about how his brother was earnest for the Lord. The McShane family grew up in mostly evangelical congregations in the Scottish church, but Robert, even though he went through all kind of the catechetical exercises and Lord's Day services, would say he wasn't converted, and David was always urging him,
mm,
and had a very serious, I think, fixed view upon the Lord Jesus. And so when David dies, it basically strikes Robert in a way with this almost spiritual blow from which he never recovers. And,
mm,
and that'd be a good thing, because that's even exact language that he almost seems to
mm,
use, because he'll talk about 11 years after David dies, he'll speak about, 11 years ago today, I lost a brother and began to seek a brother who can never
mm,
die. And so it's clear that even though it's not exactly, we're not exactly sure on the timing of it, but David dies, Robert is 18, he begins to earnestly seek after salvation. It's sometime later in the coming months, not too far into the future, that even reading this kind of old dusty book, The Sum of Saving Knowledge, he talks
mm,
about this book that was usually just kind of a dry systematic theology appended to the Westminster Confession of Faith, that Robert is reading through that, and the Lord uses that book in
mm,
combination with David's death to bring him to a place
mm,
of what he would refer to as saving change in that sense. And so,
mm,
as his letters go, he talks about, just earnestly seeking the Lord the minute he's converted. He gets all of his card playing, puts that aside, tries to put dancing aside, these kind of Sunday evening, Sabbath breaking, as his conscience would then see it. These Sunday evening meetings, he puts them
mm,
aside and just resolves earnestly to pursue the Lord, and quite soon after that to pursue ministry itself.
mm. So, how did he go from that into theological training and education?
Yeah, it's really almost consequent to his conversion is his call to ministry. And it does go through what would be the kind of Presbyterian polity of the time, where he expresses a desire to go into ministry. Presbytery kind of works through him in that desire. And it's in the year after David dies, the year after, or within the year really of being converted, that he's going to the Divinity Hall there in Edinburgh in September of 1831,
mm,
where he's now a formal ministerial student in what would be that central seminary location for the time.
mm. And he kind of, during that time, it kind of came into a group of brothers in Christ that were like-minded, and they were studying under Thomas Chalmers. Is that correct,
Mhm.
Dr. Stone?
Yeah, that's correct. And even when it comes to understanding McShane, I mean, there's a whole book that somebody could do, I
Mm,
think, genuinely. It may even be just a dissertation someone can do, a detailed analysis of how
mm,
McShane, at least kind of my very simple argument has been, I think McShane represents what is for Thomas Chalmers an ideal minister. If
mm,
Chalmers was to kind of, I think, sketch out the emphases and personality of what he would see as an ideal pastor, I think it basically creates someone very much
mm,
like Robert Murray McShane. So therefore, when you're thinking about McShane, you have to reckon with, who Thomas Chalmers is, because he's a figure that even Ian Murray wrote in his book Scottish Christian Heritage, almost has fallen victim to the danger of having written too much in his ministry.
mm,
Because Murray speak about many people are lost to history because they don't write. And he
mm,
says, well, it's almost like Chalmers has been lost to much of history because he wrote so much. I mean, the man
mm,
was such an immensely gifted person that even Andrew Fuller, after hearing
mm.
Thomas Chalmers preach, Fuller said, well, if he would throw away his papers, he would be king of Scotland. That would just be illustrative of the degree to which
Wow.
Chalmers had this genuine
Mm,
influence over the entire nation in 19th century Scotland, where one well-known historian would more or less say that Chalmers was the principal figure of Scotland in the 1800s. So
mm,
Chalmers basically is at the Divinity Hall. He teaches these classes that are so popular they have to add this additional gallery, and Robert really comes under the influence of Chalmers and
mm,
takes particularly things about his ministerial model directly to heart. Chalmers clearly sees Robert as unusually gifted.
mm,
He invites him into what's the exegetical society. We can talk about that more if it's useful. The visiting society, if it's that useful. It's almost like these Chalmers appointed special groups of
mm,
students preparing for the ministry. And McShane had a very close friend who eventually became a well-known missionary and even minister in the Church of Scotland named Alexander Somerville.
mm,
And Somerville and them had and Robert had been kind of elementary school friends. So he came into
mm,
Divinity Hall with one of his closest friends, and it was through those Chalmers appointed groups that he Robert became very close with Andrew Bonar, who
mm,
was kind of the individual that under the Lord's hand of providence is singularly
mm,
responsible for McShane's abiding influence just through his work of writing the biography and putting together the remains
mm,
that so celebrated.
mm, mm. Yeah, I could just sit here and let you. I could just sit here and listen to you all day long. Um, so obviously, McShane was greatly impacted by Chalmers, and it influenced him greatly in his life. As you were speaking, I was thinking about Andrew Bonar's his diary. He speaks often, and he refers, and he doesn't always name the individuals, but he talks often, almost with an admiration of McShane. And,
Hmm.
and whenever you read that, he talks about how a brother in the writing or a brother in the letter said something and it was deeply convicting to him. And there are times he explicitly references McShane.
Yep.
There's one that said, he said that he was when it was a Monday, and McShane had written to him in a letter that he is tempted to say, I gave yesterday to the Lord, today's
Right.
mine, essentially.
Yep. Yep.
And Bonar was like, that. that's quickened him. It's convicted him. It's caused him to think. Could you elaborate a little bit on the exegetical society or group? Because I think that Bonar actually speaks quite a bit about that in his diary and the
Yeah,
benefit and the blessing of it.
yeah, definitely. I mean, what Chalmers basically does is grab what he sees as the most capable seminary students
Mm,
exegetically. So they're very skilled in the original languages,
mm,
even though you're not going to find original language work in McShane's sermons. And you're usually not going to find that in any of the McShane school
mm,
preaching because it's just not how preaching was conceived of at the time. I mean, these brothers,
mm,
these young men were incredibly gifted. You
mm,
know, that all of them know Latin. McShane, when it seems like in his journal, sometimes he wants to kind of unfold the true depth of his heart, he just writes in
mm,
Latin instead of English. And so that what they would do is they would
mm,
gather on the weekend, Saturday mornings, and early in the morning, these guys would gather together and they would present exegetical papers
mm,
on an assigned piece of scripture, essentially, and it'd be it'd be a lecture of sorts, a commentary of sorts, and it would be here's my exegetical analysis of the given text to me, and then the group would interact with what the analysis offered
mm,
was, and that honed not just their ability to interpret scripture. I think it genuinely honed their ability to communicate some of the depths that they were seeing
mm,
in God's word. And so it instills within McShane and his brotherhood of friends a very Bible centered view of preaching, because I think a lot of times, even sometimes critique of McShane's preaching from some of his contemporaries, but certainly more in our day today, it feels like he doesn't go deep enough into the text.
mm,
And it's a conversation we could eventually have in the next few minutes, but when it belongs to his preaching, he's doing something different in his preaching,
mm,
trying to explain the depths of the text. He's trying to present Christ from the text, and there's a large gap in
mm,
between those two ends.
mm. So, how did his learning and education, and his time with those brothers? I mean, I can't. I mean, I just know from the time I spend with brothers in Christ and talking about the things of the Lord on challenging topics, um, it it bolsters my longing and desire for the Lord, my longing and desire for holiness, godliness. And in some ways, I think it molds us and shapes us into the ministers that we are. Um, like when we think about that time that McShane had under Chalmers with those brothers, and they stayed in close contact, and they were in a relatively close geographical area
Yep.
as well. Isn't that correct?
Yep. Yep.
And so, how did all of this mold his personal holiness and his godliness in his life, his heart for Christ?
Yeah, I mean that's a huge conversation
Mm,
as it belongs to McShane studies, because if there's such a thing as a spiritual gift of friendship, McShane had it. He
yeah.
never married, and therefore he had, of course, a need, I think, for fellowship outside of
Hmm.
his home that he got with these men in ministry.
Mm,
They were close, not just in the seminary, they were close in their later missionary life. Some of them would, like Bonar and McShane, would go on this famed mission of inquiry
mm,
to Jerusalem and back together. And because of the nature of the Scottish communion season that
mm,
dominated the Scottish kirk when McShane was a pastor, you would have this constant, the way that I read the letters, it's just this revolving door of invitations from McShane to other guys
mm,
in his circle, from other guys in the circle to McShane, of come help
mm,
me administer communion on this date.
mm.
And so it seems like at least monthly, if not a little more than that, these guys are in each other's ministerial
Yeah.
orbit to administer communion, because you needed so many ministers to do it the way it was structured. And
Mm,
what's unique about that when it comes to his life and ministry, these guys are hearing each other preach, they're talking and praying before and after these
mm,
services, and it very much becomes, I think, in some ways for his ministry, the singular kind of iron sharpens iron experience for his ministry, because they would critique each other's preaching.
mm,
They didn't have any problem with that. They didn't have any problem with urging different interpretations of a text that may
mm,
or may not have been given on the evening. But the big thing was there was spiritual conversation that was always focused
mm,
on the things of the Lord, stirring up a heart unto the reality of eternity, the need
mm,
for earnest evangelism. And the brothers would spend, when they were together and even apart,
mm,
they had very distinctly dedicated times to pray for each
mhm,
other, such that it'd be like a you and I, Kyle, across the states, almost covenanting, but they would be
mm,
promising on 9 p.m. on Saturday night,
mhm,
we will be at the mercy seat to pray for each other's sermons tomorrow. And then at 11 a.m.
mm,
on Monday morning, we're going to pray through these prayer points that one of us has put together and mailed out to the entire
mm,
group. And those kind of things made him the minister he was, and vice versa. Most of those guys after he died would speak about his friendship, as kind of you alluded to, even with Andrew Bonar, just a lifelong influence
mm,
from just even a short ministry tenure.
mm. Yeah. As I was reading Bonar's diary yesterday, I thought, I want to go back, and I'm going to start doing it as I continue reading, and listing every context and situation in which they pray,
Yeah.
because it's really remarkable. Um, I feel like there is such a willingness to part ways and to interact and have fellowship and have communion with brothers and sisters in Christ. And there's today I'm speaking of, and not pray and not spend time in prayer. It seems as though that group of men were always seeking the face of God together. They were always laboring um, in prayer, physically when they were present with each other, and like you're saying, covenanting, almost agreeing to do so at certain times and in certain ways for certain things. Um, yeah, no wonder um, their holiness and their godliness and their piety was so warm and well rounded, because they were constantly laboring in prayer.
Yep.
Mm. So how did he transition from that time of preparation, in a sense, under Chalmers, to his ministry in Dundee?
Hmm.
And could you? So I've spent a little time in Bruce McLennan's book, McShane's Dundee.
Yeah.
The context of Dundee, the church, um, and the socio-political uh, characteristics of the day, it's crazy. Uh,
Hmm.
there was a lot going on in the world, and he was ministering in a very unique place and a very unique time. Could you elaborate a little bit on some of those things, Dr. Stone?
Yeah. I mean, the realities like swimming around the 1830s that were always
Mm,
shaping not just McShane's context there in Dundee, but even how he would talk in his preaching and ministry
mm,
are vital to remember. So this is kind of the age of romanticism as a philosophy. This is a few years before what we would now speak about as like the Victorian
mm,
age showing up, but you can already to see some of its distinct emphases. This is the industrialization that's going in the time, and even how in Dundee in particular for McShane's ministry, how that sucks up young children to be working in ways
mhm,
that previous generations would find rather foreign in a lot
mm,
of parts of the nation. And so when he goes to St. Peter's in Dundee, he's the first pastor. So that was a
mm,
essentially, we would talk about it now as a church plant.
mm,
And because of the nature of the Church of Scotland being a national church, it would have different implications for McShane in his time than ours, which is he's assigned a very distinct geographic part of the city.
mm,
So when he shows up, they have already built a church that seats 1,100 people,
mm,
and he's going to be the pastor of this very large congregation.
mm,
And he's the first one that they choose. Actually, a few of his close friends were part of the number of candidates that were recommended to St. Peter's. And when he came and preached his sermon, it seems like in the record there was a pretty decided agreement among the people involved calling him kind of on a search committee like responsibility we would speak of
Mm,
today. They just decided that this man is the man that we want, and he comes
mm,
in November of 1836 as their first pastor. And it's a very fruitful ministry
mm,
from the off, and it becomes a very celebrated ministry really within about 3 years, and certainly until the end of his death. It's a nationally heralded ministry, not without its criticism for sure,
mm,
but it's belonging to this broader conflict also in the ecclesiastical realm of the Church of Scotland that we refer to as the 10 Years conflict, that
mm,
gives rise to the Great Disruption that belongs to 1843. So
mhm,
he's got these kind of philosophical, cultural, and ecclesiastical things that are shaping his ministry and even pressing into his
mm,
ministry in a particular way. And it was a very, like I said, it was a very fruitful ministry right from the
mm.
beginning there in the part of Dundee where St. Peter's was and still is.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem like it would have been an easy time and an easy place um, to minister. You know, the difficulties of the day. I think we have many difficulties in our day, and in some ways um, they just manifest themselves differently in every age and every day. So I didn't realize until this last couple weeks that McShane actually thought that, and you please correct me if I'm incorrect, um, that he thought his church was too large, and he thought that that was a problem in the church of that day, that the churches were too large. Is that correct, Dr. Stone?
Yeah, that would be accurate. I mean, there's this. Yeah, it's so different than how at least most of our ordinary churches go today, which you have
Mm-hmm.
that very defined like geographic area, and it's a lot. It's a lot of people not
Mm-hmm.
only coming to St. Peter's for Sunday services, 7 to 800 every Thursday night for a congregational prayer meeting. And
Mm-hmm.
McShane is visiting constantly
Mm-hmm.
through the week people that would be there on Sunday, people that wouldn't be there on Sunday. And it's an immense amount to handle.
Mm-hmm.
And granting, if you kind of take those numbers, but maybe just simply with 1,100 people on a Sunday, he is what we would talk about, at least in my own denomination, which is a Presbyterian denomination, somewhat similar to kind of McShane's day of old. And the way we talk about these things is he's a solo pastor in this
Mm-hmm.
huge church. And so he doesn't know anything other than constantly going to and fro. And he
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't want it different. But we would look at it today and think that's too much for any one
Mm-hmm.
man to handle. And so smaller churches necessary, more ministers is necessary. And
Mm-hmm.
McShane, part of the reason he even, or one thing you would find with him is he was super involved in what they would call church extension. We'd refer to that now as church planting, but
Mm-hmm.
he raised millions and millions of pounds for the time
Mm.
for church plants because he wanted more and more churches to be ministering to the people and the great need that was true in Scotland.
That's amazing because he was only there 6.5 years.
Correct.
And so he did a lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's
six and
one. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's just one of the things that it's astonishing that you basically have in McShane's ministry. Like you said, 6.5 years. You have 3 years at the beginning. Then you have this middle section where he's to Jerusalem and back on this famed mission of inquiry. Then you have another 3 years at the end. And it has this very kind of interesting way. It works exactly like that three-part sequence that it's very balanced.
mm,
And it's in the grand scheme of things, it's a shorter ministry, for
mm-hmm,
example, than I have already had at my current context at Redeemer.
mm,
But the fruit of it in its time,
mm,
and of course, almost 200 years since,
yeah,
is genuinely amazing. It's just
yeah,
astonishing what the Lord has used it for.
mm, mm. So would you call him a well-rounded minister in his ministry? So he didn't just preach, he visited, he counseled. Was there any distinct aspect of his ministry that you would say stood out?
Yeah, what would stand out, at least let me just say there's something that stands out for his context, and I think that there are more things that would stand out to us today in that pastoral paradigm and pattern. But
Mm,
what stood out in his context, at least in the way that people kind of tended to assess his ministry, was the tone of his preaching,
mm,
because visitation, everyone was doing,
mhm,
praying, everyone was doing, engaged in broader church work, even the
mm,
10 conflict, so many were doing.
mm,
But what was so unique about McShane, and I don't think it's mere hagiography and like the subsequent secondary sources,
mm,
is there was a tone that belonged to his ministry. Some people have variously referred to it as gentleness or winsomeness. I think it's actually better to think about it as tenderness, because the way he even
mm,
conceives preaching in his writing and his sermons, that's the word he uses more
mm,
often than not. It's a very tender ministry. It's not at all concerned to preach about judgment and hell, but it's this tenderness, a sincerity of tenderness that wins over hearers in the droves. And that's
mm,
what stood out in the time. Now, what would stand out to us, I think, in many of our contexts today, is just the degree of visitation he did, the
mhm,
specificity that and intentionality that belonged to that visitation, where again, he would um, be here, there, and
mm,
everywhere throughout the day. He's walking, sometimes he's riding around on his donkey, but he's
mm,
visiting people constantly. And at that time, pastoral ministry did not
mm,
know, at least I would read the 19th century sources in this way, they don't know rest and vacation the way we talk about rest and
mm,
vacation. They
mm,
tended to rest when they were sick. They tended to go on long vacations, at least long
mm,
time away from the pulpit, probably is the right way to say it,
mhm,
when they were sick. So it's
mhm,
very common, like in a 12-month span of the year, that these brothers would be out of the ministry for 3 months, just convalescing
mhm,
from sickness on their sick bed. And that's got its own kind of
mm,
recuperating powers, I think, for pastors. And so
mm,
he was constantly on the move,
mm,
and he was constantly sick too. That's a different part of his story that's quite true too.
mm. Yeah, that was one other thing that has stood out to me uh, as I've read and researched and studied on McShane. Because you take that 6.5 years and the time he was either gone or sick or um, ministering elsewhere, I think you could whittle it down to probably around 5
Hmm.
or less, because he was he was absent quite a bit, and I think that there does seem to be some evidence in the life of the church that the people would have liked him to be a little bit more present, or at least they desired and longed for their pastor to be among them more than he was. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's fundamentally true. He'll acknowledge it later on in his ministry that there
Mm,
are people that were, depending on the degree to which it sounded like a complaint or a grievance or just a wish
mm,
of something not fulfilled. As he comes back from the mission of inquiry, there's that famous
mm,
revival that happens in
mm,
Dundee under William Chalmers Burns.
mm,
As his
mm,
renown increases and he's going here, there, and
mm,
everywhere preaching and serving the Lord's Supper too, but
mm,
he's gone a lot. And
mm,
understandably, people want him there more than he's there. And
mm,
so he certainly was facing some of that feedback, and I think it was deserved feedback in many
mm.
ways.
Yeah, I think about the revival that you just mentioned, when William Chalmers Burns was present and McShane was absent. Um, I can't help but think that, because I think about McShane's preaching and some of the accounts of his preaching and the presence of God and the power of God and the authority that accompanied his
Hmm.
preaching. Um, I can't help but think, and I find it very interesting that that almost prepared the way for the Dundee revival, but then he was absent when it arrived and the Lord sent it. And in some ways, and I haven't done a bunch of reading on this, his heart, he had to wrestle in his heart of hearts with the fact that he was not present when that came about. But I do know from reading that he praised God that it did come about, whether he was there or not.
Yeah.
But I mean, I know as a minister and one that longs to see revival and one that longs to see God pour out his spirit in greater measure and greater degree, and longs to see the Lord do something wonderful and great in the midst of his congregation, that would be hard for me. I'm not Robert Murray McShane by any, but I would struggle with that. And I'm sure that some of that is pride and vanity, um, misplaced confidence. But do you think he wrestled with that? Do we have evidence of that, or
Yeah. Yeah, just to set some of the context for people that may not know it,
mm,
he essentially is gone
mm,
in 1839 from April to November on this, they called it mission of inquiry, which was McShane, Andrew Boner, and a couple other guys appointed by the Church of Scotland to go to Jerusalem and back. And so, mission of inquiry, and so
mm,
inquire about places for future missionary endeavors to reach Jewish people for Jesus. So they go on this
mm,
month-long trip to Jerusalem and back. It's hard for people today
mm,
to recognize how famous that mission trip was. There were reports that would come
mm,
back while they were on the trip that are essentially front page
mm,
news. They write this book
mm,
that's a report of their trip that becomes a bestseller in the time, and it's an incredibly notable moment
mm,
that these guys are going to Jerusalem and back. Well, while he's gone,
mm,
he's got a young pastor. So both these guys are already in their 20s, but even younger than Robert
mm,
is William Chalmers Burns, who McShane has asked to fill his pulpit in
mm,
his absence. And in the McShane school, Chalmers Burns is, I think, probably rightly understood as he's the preacher of the McShane school. The
mm,
degree to which Burns could go places, here, there, and
mm,
everywhere, different contexts, different congregations, and the spirit work through his preaching was just
mm,
unbelievable. There's a solemnity, there's a directness, there's an urgency,
mm,
there's a hearing that he would get that was unique. So Chalmers Burns is preaching while McShane is gone. Revival
mm,
comes to St. Peter's in Dundee in the fall before
mm,
McShane turns. Now, to part of your question is before he left McShane, he wrote, he said, I expect a blessing to
mm,
come in my absence. Now, these
mm,
brothers had been praying for revival for a long time. Even a couple of years prior,
mm,
McShane had preached a very well regarded sermon that was titled, Why is God a Stranger in the
mm,
Land? And I think it got published, if I recall correctly, as a booklet that just got circulated throughout the denomination and broader nation.
mm,
And there was had been a long tenured pattern of praying for revival, laboring for revival. Revival
mm,
comes when McShane's gone. He's not surprised by it at all because
mm,
he was expecting it. And the way you kind of work through the parts of what he writes regarding this is at its
mm,
most basic level, he sees revival coming when he's not there as the Lord's demonstration, number one, of God is sovereign over the salvation of his people and will use whatever instrument he wants to use. And then number two, and really consequent to that, it was meant to humble
mm,
McShane
yeah,
that he was not necessary for the revival
mm,
that he had so desperately been laboring for and
mm,
praying for. The Lord was pleased to use another instrument to bring it about. Now, McShane, when he
mm,
came back in November of 39, it kind of continued under him for a while and he became a very well-known spokesman for revival. But he would see it at its core. The reason why it came when he was gone is because it was one of the many things the Lord was doing in his life to increase
mm,
his true and sincere humility
mm.
in his ministry.
Doesn't he write somewhere that along those same lines that um he that the Lord sent revival, or maybe it was just his absences and his sickness, that he had to be away and someone had to fill the pulpit so that his people wouldn't idolize him?
Yeah, well, that's true too. I mean, he would have pastoral letters a lot of times when he was sick that would
Mm,
go back and talk about some of this vanity and idolatry that would belong to his celebrated ministry, because he goes on the mission of inquiry largely at the behest of some denominational leaders who see it.
mm,
Not only is it something that would be uh, not only McShane an ideal figure to go, but according to the medicinal theory of the time, the change of climate would actually be good for his health that continued to fail and fall apart. And
mm,
so, as he's convalescing in the kind of winter months of what would that be, 38 to 39, 1838 to 39, he's conversing with leaders about this trip. And they say, well, you should go on this trip because you'll heal up on this
mm,
trip and rest up on this trip. And then, as he's sick, preparing for the trip, he's writing these pastoral letters back to the
mm,
congregation that would communicate, among other places. He would say more or less exactly what you just mentioned, Kyle, is that it's a way that the Lord is stripping the congregation of
mm,
its idolatry of their minister.
mm,
And that would happen certainly in memorials after his death, is that
mm,
uh, even in some of the McShane school, they would see his death as having that function in
mm,
terms of removing too much of a perhaps minister centeredness belonging
mm,
to St. Peter's.
mm, mm. Yeah, man, that'd be hard though. Yeah. So, yeah, one of the things as we're talking and I'm thinking about McShane's desire for usefulness, his longing for usefulness, his longing for revival, but also his evangelistic heart. You know, you think about how he is, you know, he is all about the means of grace and seeking the face of God personally, growing in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ, having this well-rounded personal holiness, spending time with the Lord. And then but then we also see that out of that comes this desire for greater usefulness and this evangelism and this missionary desire. So it's interesting because you we find in McShane that um, Calvinist Calvinistic piety is not antithetical
Hmm.
to evangelism and missionary work. You know, we see this great balance with this spirituality of this brother and his evangelistic labor and work. I think that's one of the things that we see in his life so well. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that part of the reason I think that he continues to be so attractive to many
Mm,
people, even in the 21st century, is for the reasons you just mentioned,
mm,
which is its urgency
mm,
and sincerity in evangelism. He once said in a sermon,
mm,
I think I have never, he
mm,
basically said, I can never remember a day when I haven't woken up thinking about how I might bring someone to Jesus today.
mm,
And
mm,
that was a sincere thing. I mean, the way
mm,
that I think you read through reports, look at his own kind of inner wrestlings with his life and ministry, he's always at pains to see people converted. That's why
mm,
his sermons have such an evangelistic bent to them.
mm,
And it would be true of so many in that kind of circle of McShane's
mhm,
world in the 19th century and even Scottish Calvinism at the time,
mm,
that th- there is a legion of ministers and missionaries and ordinary church members that are showing how the doctrines of
mm,
grace in no way um, ought to necessarily in any way do anything other than spur people to evangelism
yeah.
urgently, sincerely. It doesn't, the doctrines of grace don't throw kind of cold water on that fire. Actually, it's meant to fuel that fire. And McShane just, I think, is a wonderful example of how that
Mhm,
ought to work out and can work out in an ordinary ministry.
mm, mm. Yeah, he's a great model and a great example of what real godliness looks like and how real godliness acts um, in the Christian life.
Hmm.
And yeah, mm. So he had a short life, but he had a really enduring impact. He died at 29, like many other people. So he was young. When we think about his legacy and the heritage he has left behind as a pastor historian, Why do you think Andrew Bonar's memoir and remains had such a welcome reception? And could you briefly, because I read one of your articles about the reception of
Mhm.
the memoirs, and how everybody embraced it and
Mhm.
everybody loved it. Why did it have such a lasting impact uh, on that, and why were people so eager to devour that? I'm sure some of it is because of the reasons we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think one thing that's just contextual that certainly serves the popularity of the memoir and remains is it was a biography writing age.
mm,
Just even within the tiny group of the McShane
mm,
School, how they wrote biographies of each other, and it's just very normal. And even the Evangelical Party of the Church of Scotland and ministers who
mm,
would actually participate
mm,
in Great Disruption, biographies are written of pastors a lot, and it
mm,
was therefore in a context where there was a kind of ready-made audience for that kind of
mm,
spiritual biography in a way that does seem to be different than our age today in a
mhm,
variety of different ways. So that's true, and I think what also you have by the end of the century in the 1800s are some of the largest figures on both sides of the pond, so in the English speaking world, that are commending McShane.
mm,
Because even, Spurgeon, none other than Spurgeon,
mm,
will commend the Memoir and Remains as one of the most profitable volumes ever
mm,
published. And that kind of has given you a sense of how popular it is. Now, the reason
mm,
from my vantage point
mm,
that it has such popularity is it is brief. When you're
mhm,
dying just before turning 30, there's only so much
mhm,
that you can actually communicate in a biography. So it's
mm,
accessible in that sense. So
mhm,
the memoir and remains, when you look at it, the vast majority of what Banner of Truth has kept in print for so long now is just original material from McShane's pen with sermons and letters
mm,
and journals. The biography itself is pretty slim, so it's very accessible. Bonar was a fantastic writer,
mhm,
and he has a way of, I think, because he knew Robert so well, I
mm,
think the heart of McShane comes through in that book that is just attractive,
mm,
and it's pronounced. And then the other thing I would say, and maybe the last thing on this
mm,
point, unless you kind of have some other thoughts related to it, is I've often observed with a figure like McShane, whom the Lord takes at a young age. You have
mm,
something similar, for example, like David Brainerd or Henry
mm,
Martin. They kind of become, and I don't think again it's uh, hagiographical. It's this encapsulation of an ideal.
mhm,
So, like with Brainerd, encapsulation perhaps of an ideal of
yeah,
the inner heart as it wrestles with missionary, something similar with Henry Martin. But with McShane, I think because he had this very brief ministerial
mhm,
career, because he ministered in a context of the 19th century, which is really important in my
mhm,
mind, that's free from all of the kind of cultural, political, and frankly, slavery realities in the United States at the
mm,
time that invariably get attached to various people. He doesn't have the kind of cultural scandals that he's having to work through in
mhm,
a way that we now historically speaking, often have to work through with 19th
mhm,
century figures. But that's not to say McShane, so I think he encapsulates an ordinary ministry. It doesn't mean he's free from critique. It doesn't mean he's free from any sort of perhaps constructive feedback on what maybe was a shortcoming here and there. But I think he encapsulates, in my mind, this just very compressed ideal portrait of what ordinary ministry should look like.
mm,
You love the Lord in your personal life. You preach Jesus urgently in your sermons. You pray for your people. You plant
mhm,
churches. You go on missionary trips. You visit. You urge them to know Christ
mhm,
increasingly. And that's what his ministry was about. And I think most godly people know that's what ministry should be about. And
mhm,
McShane thus offers a very compelling portrait of what it
mhm,
can look like.
mm, yeah. Um, so I think that we see that throughout history, like with Brainerd, especially McShane. Yes, the Lord used them for His kingdom and His glory while they lived, but I think also in the spirit of like Hebrews 11, we find that oftentimes um, certain individuals become more useful following their death.
Hmm.
And so, like, I remember when I first was introduced to that idea, It was when I was reading. Um, it wasn't the life and diary of David Brainerd, but it was a book about the life and diary of David Brainerd, and the author actually talks about how it's almost as though his influence became 100-fold of what it was during his life.
Right.
And so I think we do, to an extent, see the very same thing in the life of McShane, that his influence expanded because there were these model elements and aspects of his ministry, and it was so concise and short and clear. Yeah, the Lord has certainly used him, and he's left an enduring legacy. One of the ways is that the Lord has definitely continued to use him is through the Bible reading plan.
Hmm.
And now, do you do that? I personally,
Yep,
brother, how has
I
that been
do.
a how has that been a benefit to you? Uh,
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually have on 2 or 3 occasions in the last, what is it now, 18 years, kind of moved away from the McShane plan early in a calendar year and then gone back to it quite quickly because it doesn't seem to suit maybe my spiritual personality. And it's been beneficial to me because I do think particularly, and that's how I came across it with Lloyd Jones's commendation of the plan, which is he
mm,
said basically McShane's plan is the bare minimum for what a
mm,
past Bible reading life should entail. And
mm,
I wouldn't want to lay down too hard of a yoke on something like that. But I do think the benefit of McShane's plan is it gets you through the Bible in a year,
mhm,
gets you the New Testament twice and Psalms twice.
mhm,
So therefore, it's I think over time doing something in the pastor's mind and heart that is probably hard to actually see what it's doing, but particularly what's helpful
mm,
to me, having not grown up in a tradition that would see some degree of a central importance to the
mm,
Psalter, like having a plan that works you through
mm,
all 150 Psalms twice in a year on top of everything else, yet
mhm,
still usually only 4 chapters a day is, I think, very, again, it's helpful to just how the soul grows in godliness. And so I've just found it a profoundly soul shaping and
mm,
mind stirring. And that's why it's hard to think of doing something else.
mm. Yeah, I've had the exact same experience. The Lord has blessed that spiritual discipline in my own life a great deal. I heard Mark Dever say one time that, I got to say it right, that intercessory prayer, he's confident that intercessory prayer is the most productive and effective spiritual discipline in his life. Um, but, for my own soul, I would say that the Bible reading plan that I utilize from Robert Murray McShane is the most beneficial for my own soul.
Hmm.
And so it has been such a huge blessing, and it's impacted so many people. Lloyd Jones, at the end of his life, when he was so weak, he couldn't even speak. He had his, I don't know if it was wife or daughter, but he had them finish his Bible reading by reading it out loud so that he could
Mm.
continue it, before he went to be in the glory.
Yep.
And so, yeah, there's great benefit. I'd encourage anybody who listens to this or is listening to this and they haven't ever researched or checked into the McShane Bible reading calendar, as it's been called, or the McShane Bible reading plan, to look at that and research it and figure out a best way and read his comments ahead of time before the plan, because they are gold. The preface and introduction to that is so beneficial with regards to when you should do it, when you shouldn't do it, um, when you need to take a break, and the reasons behind it. He did that for his congregation initially, isn't that correct, Dr. Stone?
Yeah, it was originally written. So it's interesting because it is in some circles, I think, aside from a couple of choice quotes, like the most enduring part of McShane's
Mm,
legacy in terms of its genuine global uh,
mm,
influence. And so he writes it near the end of his life. I mean, it is
mm,
within 12 months of dying
mm,
that he put it together and published it. It really originally comes out as a tract called Daily Bread, and it's
mm,
just written for the congregation, but then it gets used wider than that. And it's written
mm,
for St. Peter's. And he's got, like you said, and you can find it online with the original
mm,
comments, kind of prefatory remarks that talk through, I mean, the benefits of going through this, the dangers
mm,
of going through this, how to make sure you're using it in a way that's blessing not only your life in the Lord, but your
mm,
family's life in the Lord, because
mm,
half of it was meant to be used in family devotions, the other half was meant to be used in your personal time.
mm,
And so he writes it for St. Peter's, and in large part, it becomes in his ideal, it becomes a key part of his even visitation ministry,
mm,
because people in the church are following it and using it diligently. He can show up at their
mm,
house. He knows what they probably read today in the Bible, or maybe are soon going to read today
mm,
in the Bible. And it becomes a starter for spiritual
yeah.
conversation and a way that is genuinely helpful for pastoral ministry.
Mm, mm, yeah. Um, well, I was going to ask you something. Oh, it was preserved through the memoirs. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's in there, and it in the back, depending on which edition you have. Usually, it's part of essentially an appendix where you have his commentary in there, and then no small number of outlets today, and even Bible apps today, without the initial kind of introductory comments, you can use the McShane plan. And the only thing that tends to be missing from the more kind of modern republications of it is what are, I guess, probably two things, one of which is his ideal was is half of it's used for personal devotions, as we might call them today, and the other half would be used for family devotions or family worship. So
Mm,
it had a very um, keen interest in promoting family worship if you're using it in its original intent. So that's
mm,
something helpful to note. And then in one of the original introductory remarks, he's also urging people when they're going through the Psalms, because you do it twice in a year, is to often sing the Psalms. And his hope
mm,
was that through the course of this plan, even singing Psalms, they might get through singing the whole Psalter in the
mm,
course of a calendar year. So for people who aren't coming from traditions or denominations that would ever sing a psalm,
mm,
the plan actually has some degree of kind of putting the Bible's songbook before a
mm,
household or a person in a way that can really be really beneficial also.
mm, mm. Dr. Stone, this has been so edifying. As we think about his legacy and what he's left behind for modern ministers and believers today, um, what are some lessons and some applications as we think about the life and the legacy of Robert Murray McShane? Or another way, how can we better serve the church today, better serve the risen Lord Jesus Christ today as a result of honoring, preserving, and learning from this godly figure, Robert Murray McShane? How would you answer that?
Yeah, let me just mention three things
Mm,
perhaps that, we always want to think about with
mm,
McShane, and I haven't had necessarily the chance because we've got so much we could talk about and have
mm,
talked about. But the first of which would be kind of the way I would want to think about it is the pulse beat that belongs to love for Christ in our ministry and life. So I do think McShane's life and ministry gives us a vivid portrait of Second Corinthians 5:14, where the Apostle Paul talks about being constrained and controlled by the love of Christ in his
mm,
ministry. That's particularly in a text related
mm,
to his evangelistic preaching, really.
mm,
So I think McShane shows us how a heart that's beating
mm,
in what is in a very affectionate, spiritually speaking, very affectionate love for Christ ought to
mm,
overflow into our life and ministry. And so that's why he was always careful when he talked about, words, sacrament, and prayer,
mm,
means of grace. He would talk about them to make sure that we recognize they are means, not ends.
mm,
They're not, they're means to grow in the Lord. And the end, of course, is always increasing in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so I think that kind of
mm,
permeating and
mm,
animating part of his life, that love for Christ is controlling and constraining him.
mm,
It's worth thinking about. The second thing would be, and this is certainly part of his celebrated
mm,
legacy, rightly so, which is his personal holiness.
mm,
One of the most useful quotes that I think so many people still are struck by. And it's just the idea that it's not great talents that God blesses, but great likeness to Jesus. And
mm,
so, in continually in our world that often is looking for better methods,
mm,
we want to recognize that God is looking, at least as we think about it in pastoral ministry, for better men who
Mm-hmm.
are who are bursting with love for Christ, who are full of the Spirit's power,
Mm,
who are eager to glorify the Father in all things. And that has an attractiveness to it that I don't know if we
mm,
can always get our words around. And the way that I would think about this
mm,
is there is there is a sincerity of holiness, speaking now to pastoral ministry, a sincerity of holiness in the minister that has an undeniable attraction to it when it's sincere in the Spirit's work. So
yes.
a pastor may not have the greatest rhetorical ability in his preaching. He may not have the most kind of engaging, winsome,
Mm,
and winning personality, but all of us are called to strive for the holiness without which we won't see the Lord. And that holiness bursting from a love for
mm,
Christ, I actually think is what the Spirit uses
mm,
so often
yes.
in our life and ministry. And the other thing, so if there's that kind of
Mm,
love for Christ, the sincerity of personal holiness would be true of McShane that we ought to always remember is he genuinely lived as a man on the brink of eternity. And he had known sickness his whole life. He had experienced death, of course, in his family and close friends, many in his church. He took it as a normal weekly pattern where he would go visit
mm,
the dying people on Saturday so that the coming Lord's Day, usually, within 18 to 24 hours, he could preach as one who's on the brink. And so
mm,
he shows us what can happen when a life is lived as though eternity is real
yeah.
and people are going to hell and people are going to heaven
Mm,
and the Lord is coming for people unsuspecting. And so I think that actually fuels so much of his urgency in ministry, but at the same time I think it
mm,
feels so much of the gravity in his ministry. Like we,
yeah.
we are dealing with eternal realities and we dare not trifle, which is why those men in the McShane school and even McShane himself, they were going nonstop in their
Mm,
ministry. And I wouldn't want to communicate that with our kind of modern sense of burnout as a wrong thing. I think that
mm-hmm.
there's an all-consuming, all-constraining nature that belongs to pastoral ministry
Yeah.
that is unique to pastoral ministry. And McShane shows us how an awareness of eternity just abundantly promotes that kind of gravity
Mm.
and urgency.
I think David Brainerd actually said, I love to live on the brink of eternity. And it makes me think of Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah.
Uh, does, Edwards, I can't remember exactly. He said something like, I want to have, or I have eternity stamped on my eyeballs,
Right.
something
Yeah.
like that.
It's interesting with McShane and helpful to note for people who are
Mm,
interested in Edwards and Brainerd is McShane is very clear on certain influences that he has in terms of his own
mm,
historical heroes. And the way I would kind of
mm,
work through the material, at least he speaks about Jonathan Edwards more than anyone else.
mm,
He'll reference Samuel Rutherford, Richard Baxter, for example, because of
mm,
his urgency in evangelism. John Owen, Thomas Boston, but Edwards has a
mm,
shining influence on McShane. And when you realize that David Brainerd's diary is a Jonathan Edwards edit, which means
mm,
that model of spirituality in
yeah.
Brainerd is essentially what Edwards is saying. This is my model of spirituality.
Mm,
So there are a
mm,
ton of places in McShane without
mm,
direct quotations where he's almost lifting Brainerd and Edwards'
yeah.
phrases or quotes and just using them as his own. And I don't think
Mm,
he's doing that for any other reason than it's so seeped into his
yes.
ministerial heart that it just comes out of him.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Dr. Stone, thank you so much. Thank you for joining and helping us reflect on the life and ministry of Robert Murray McShane, this godly historic figure. But also, I mean, as we're doing this, these others, he's so similar to Brainerd. He's so similar to Edwards, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about having history and being able to look back is we see how this piety is generational and it's passed down because we have the same spirit and we have the same truth and we have the same scriptures, and the Lord works in us. We have the same Lord, and so thank you so much for helping us reflect and learn about Robert Murray McCheyne and his life and his ministry. Um, do you have any, before we close, do you have any concluding words you'd like to say about McCheyne or your life? Now, can you briefly tell us, you've written on McCheyne books. What are those books, Dr. Stone?
Yeah, one of them is my dissertation. That one's titled "A Communion of Love." I tend to tell people, unless you're really interested in some of the academic nitty gritty, don't bother with that one. I put together a little kind of I think of it as like the best hits of McCheyne in the Profiles of Reformed Spirituality series that Reformation Heritage Books does. I tried to kind of
Mm,
take you, if you want to get the essence of McCheyne boiled down to some kind of tiny daily readings,
mm,
that's there. And then I did rewrite the entire dissertation and tried to make it much more popular and accessible
mm,
and probably useful in a book that was
mm,
called A Holy Minister: The Life and Legacy of Robert Murray McCheyne. And
mm,
that one I think is, if you're going to read something I've written on McShane, that would be perhaps the most
mm,
useful one, as it tries to take some of the insights I do think that may be a little
mm,
bit more unique to my formulation of his piety, at least as I read it.
mm,
But then also, just I think maybe that's the final thing to say, and I appreciate again
mm,
continue with Kyle what you guys are doing, is because there's so many men and women throughout history, like
mm,
Robert Murray McShane, that we can
yeah,
learn from, that can convict us, that can
mm,
stir us. So if that's McShane, wonderful. I think he's well worth anyone's study. And no matter
mm,
whether you're a minister or church member, he'll be a blessing to you. But if it's not McShane, I always encourage people, go find a historical hero that for one reason
yeah,
or another has a unique resonance in your heart, and just watch the Lord through the work of the Spirit
mm,
use that model to grow you in grace and knowledge.
mm, mm. Thank you so much. It's been a blessing. Uh, to our listeners, thank you for joining us and watching. Be sure to share this content with anybody you think might be edified, encouraged, or strengthened by this discussion. It would also be helpful for our ministry and for this if you would like and subscribe and share this episode. Um, until next time, friends, let's continue to honor, preserve, and learn from the heritage of godly figures in the past to better serve the church today. Thank you and blessings.